Hi, folks. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. And today we have Dr. Steve Hunt with us. Steve, welcome to this new episode of the RiseUp Radio.
Thank you. Great to be
Awesome.
here.
Folks, Steve has a very unique background. Most of us have heard artificial intelligence as a word, experienced it a little bit, but Steve has a very, very unique background and has lived around artificial intelligence as a topic since his childhood. We'll go deeper into that. But before that, a very brief introduction that I can share about him before he talks about himself a little bit. So, Steve has helped thousands of companies use technology to create more effective and agile workforces and has already written three books exploring how technology is enabling companies to rethink HR methods. Steve, I think these books are Hiring Success, Common Sense, Talent Management, and Talent Tectonics. Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's the trilogy of HR technology adventure stories.
Awesome. I don't think I can really do justice introducing you. Can you share a little bit about yourself and especially your background with our audience today before we jump deeper into the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give the AI version of my background. This is not how I would have described myself if you asked me like 3 years ago, but it's really interesting. So to kind of talk about what I do, I think it is easiest to kind of talk about where I came from, which
Hmm.
is I grew up in a family where my father was a cognitive mathematical psychologist, and he actually studied AI. Matter of fact, he did some of the very first work on AI in 1960s. When I grew up, I would share this book. I shared this with you earlier. This is a book that my father wrote in 1975 that is called Artificial Intelligence. And it's just tons of mathematical
Yeah,
equations.
it's not
And he,
LLM, folks. It's only mathematical equations.
it's all the math that goes under LLMs. And it's interesting because actually I got my undergrad degree in applied mathematics and
Mhm.
psychology. And I built neural network models as an undergrad, even, and I studied it as a graduate school. But the problem was, and my father actually in this book says this exact thing. He says the mathematics for what we call artificial intelligence, that's large language models, natural language processing,
Mhm.
machine learning. He said in that book, actually, literally said, the math works. The problem is the computers are too
Right.
slow, and we don't have enough data. And then he said in the book, this will be overcome. That was
Yep.
50 years ago.
Yep.
And then, so I grew up with it. And when I went in, I started out as a computer programmer. I wasn't a very good computer programmer, but I always had that focus on using technology. And multiple times throughout my career, starting in grad school, I looked at using what's called maximum entropy Bayesian pattern recognition systems for
Mhm.
staffing. I worked with a company that did some of the very first machine learning in 2002, where we
Mhm.
processed like 70,000 applicants a day. But the
Mhm.
problem was the technology was just ka-chunk, ka-chunk. It
Yeah.
just took too slow. We didn't have the data. And then my career, I kind of moved away, to be honest, from AI because of the limitations of that. And I
Right.
focused a lot more on how do we use technology to support more effective talent decisions, learning, all sorts of other areas. I was early on in the company SuccessFactors. People might know that. I
Mhm.
helped that company build up and really focused on really how do we use technology to create more effective work environments, taking into account the one thing about work that isn't changing, which is the psychology of people. So my background is my undergrad degree is applied mathematics, but my PhD is in industrial organizational psychology. And it's just been a fascinating ride. I mean, the last 2 years, it's weird. It's almost like I feel like I'm going back
Coming
in.
a full circle. Life is
It's
coming a full
coming full
circle.
circle. And also full circle in that, and it's a shameless plug. If what I do sounds remotely interesting to anyone out there, I really recommend that you read this in my book, Talent Tectonics, where it really talks about how is technology changing the nature of work, but also how do we need to use
Yeah.
technology in response. So
Right.
that's kind of my background.
Yeah. Uh, Folks, I don't know if you have already guessed the topic or not for today's podcast. It's all about the strengths and limitations of AI and technology, which is applied in HR practices today and in years to come, right? So I think, Steve, that's what we're going to discuss today, right?
Yeah.
So let's jump into it. But even before we go deeper into it, I think it's a very fair question that I'm going to ask you. To first, let's scope it out, right? What do you think today that AI can do and what can it not do? And maybe 5 years down the line, what it would be able to do and it still won't be able to do.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to say there's a great book called Co-Intelligence, that is a really good discussion, sort of a lay discussion about helping understand technology,
Mhm,
especially the natural language processing technology, which is the stuff that seems the most like humans.
mhm,
And before I answer your question, I will say there's a great quote in that book. He says, "Whatever AI you're using, it's the worst it will ever be."
mhm.
So it's amazing
It
how
can only
fast
get
this
better.
stuff is
Yeah,
getting. But
absolutely.
if you get to the point of what can and can it not do, and what can it never do, my father used to talk about this actually. He said that he didn't like the term artificial intelligence. He had to go with it because that's what people call it.
Mhm,
Because what these things are is very sophisticated mathematical pattern recognition algorithms.
correct.
I mean, what they do is they take data in. It's amazing the complexity of their ability to interpret this data and spot patterns. And based on that patterns, it will either spit out predictions of what it
Yep.
thinks will happen in the future. So, like in a staffing or a skills matching or whatever, like that tool, or it will tell you things that it thinks you want to hear. I
Mhm,
mean, and that's a great thing in that book, Co-Intelligence. It really is a great, the guy describes, because I love this analogy of it. He said, think of generative AI as an infinitely knowledgeable intern
yep.
who just wants to tell you, they want to give you the right information, but they have no actual idea if it's right or wrong. There's no
Right.
wisdom
Right.
in AI. And I sometimes talk about calling it artificial intelligence is like calling, like, lifesavers or Starburst candies artificial fruit. I mean, there's surface similarities, but when we run into problems is where we start trying to teach them as though they're the same thing. So in terms of what it will be able to do, it will just increasingly be able to take any form of information or any repetitive, if it's repetitive in any way, it will be able to
Mm,
automate it.
mm,
Driving, all sorts of things. Just,
mm.
what it will never be able to do is it will never be able to care for other people. It
Yep.
will never be able to say, is this an appropriate right or wrong
Mhm,
decision or action?
mhm.
It will never be able to do all the things that we actually, as humans, want from other humans.
Right.
You know, it will be able to help us, but it won't be able to support us.
Correct. So, in a nutshell, it'll be able to help us make decisions, but can't make decisions on our behalf, right?
It can help us make decisions for sure, but it cannot ensure they're the right decision.
That's always your call, right? Even any other human being can't help you make the right decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a really good example of this, and I think it's very appropriate to learning. We look at sort of
Yep.
learning, the application of learning. That I first had this realization reading an article by a clinical psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm familiar with that field, right?
Hmm,
And it was about the use of AI for counseling.
hmm,
And that also like coaching and things like that. Well, there's it gets into learning and coaching, and this clinical psychologist asked, "Could you use AI to do clinical psychology?" And
hmm.
her response was really good. She said, "It can do all the tactical stuff. As a matter of fact, in some ways, it might be able to do it better because it's infinitely aware of all the
Correct.
literature.
Correct.
But and that's really good because it can democratize a lot of access to like coaching, learning, clinicals,
Correct.
coaching, things like that, because there's a shortage of that. So it's
Hmm,
really good for democratizing and making it available to a lot of
hmm,
people. But there's one thing it can never do. She
hmm.
said a key part of a coaching counseling relationship is knowing there's another person who cares about you.
Yeah.
They care about your well-being and your growth and your development. And caring, if you look at it at the very fundamental level, what caring is, it's a human giving their life
Right.
literally in the form of time and attention
Yeah.
to the well-being of another human. It is an inherently organic process. And so I think what we run into is when we look at how AI is reshaping things, having to keep that in mind. And I think one of the risks that we have is, well, I'm a big fan of analogies, you can probably
Hmm,
tell. You know, people were not, I kind of say people were not meant when we started coming out with like processed food.
hmm,
Some processed food is better than
hmm,
starving,
hmm.
but our bodies were not meant to live off a
Correct.
steady diet of processed food,
Correct.
nor were our brains meant to live off a steady diet of artificial
Correct.
intelligence.
Correct.
We have to really think about how do we not lose that human element,
Right.
but recognizing that what we want humans to do in an AI digitalized world is different from what we want
Right.
them to do.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, No, absolutely. And that analogy is really, really strong, because at the end of the day, this is the question that people keep asking, right? Would AI be able to take our jobs, right? And my simple answer is, you know what? It won't replace you as a human being, right? What you can do as a human, how you can process emotions, how you can build relationships at the workplace,
Mhm.
it won't be able to do that at all, right? So,
Yeah.
if you're talking of a connected workplace, then yes, I mean, humans have a very integral role to play in the future as well, as they have done for centuries and centuries, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the things again, and I really dive into this in the book Talent Tectonics a lot because it's about how's technology changing the nature of
Mm,
work. And
mm,
one of the key points that I sort of make in the book is if you look what technology is doing, it's changing the very fundamental reason why people work in
mm,
society.
mm.
If you look at work's role in society 200 years ago,
Yep.
the main reason in the agricultural age, the main reason people worked was to grow and distribute food so we don't die.
Right, right.
I say, talk about meaningful work.
Yep.
Then you had the Industrial Revolution that made us far more effective at growing and distributing food. And so
Mm,
work changed from keeping us alive to making things to make us comfortable, manufacturing,
true,
cars, clothing.
true.
Now, with automation, automating all that, what we're really asking people to do is provide what are called knowledge and service jobs. They're either supposed to fix the technology when it doesn't do what it's supposed to
Correct.
do, or they're supposed to wrap around the technology to make people feel good about using whatever products or
Correct,
services are being delivered by this
correct.
technology. And really, what the purpose of work is now is to exceed people's expectations.
True.
It's to make people, solve problems, feel good about it,
Mm,
and that is a really different role of work. I think it's a very positive thing for work in
mm,
general because it's not good to do repetitive
mm,
tasks. Going back to what I said, any task that is repetitive,
correct.
no matter how complicated, AI is saying, hey, I can do that too. Whether it's reading the internet and summarizing it in
Mm-hmm,
text, which is a
mm-hmm,
repetitive task,
mm-hmm.
driving cars, whatever,
Yep.
it's doing it. So if you want to look at the future of work, it's going to be two things. It's either tasks that are not repetitive. So
Yep.
somebody asked me once a medical technician once asked me, how can I protect my job? Because there's a
Mm,
lot of medical technology is being automated.
correct.
And I was talking to her, I said, make sure that you're always doing stuff you don't know how to do.
Mm,
Because as soon as you know how to do it, there must be something about it that's repetitive because you
correct.
mastered it. But if
Correct.
you're constantly making part of your job is doing stuff that I got to figure out because nobody knows how to do it, then
Yeah.
you're always going to kind of stay ahead of the
You're
AI.
one step
And a
ahead,
lot of that is
always.
using, wow, well, the technology enabled me to do that. So I don't have to do that anymore. But now I'm going to take the technology to think about what else. And it's going to be, that's good. This is a good thing. But
Correct.
historically, we haven't managed people to learn. We've managed people to be productive, and people are
And keep
productive when they're
repeating the
doing stuff
same
they already
things
know how
again
to
and again and
do.
again and again, which is
Yeah.
getting replaced for sure, right?
Yeah, which is good, but it's a massive societal change
Correct.
in the
Correct.
concept of work.
Correct. Correct. Absolutely. Awesome. I think that there's a very nice segue to the next question that I have, which is what is the impact of AI that you're looking at currently in the overall learning space, right? It's the entire learning and development space. How is AI changing? What are the main applications and use cases that you're currently looking at in the market?
Yeah, I looked at this, and so I would go, there's several. One, AI is helping us get much better understanding what is it people need to learn.
Hmm.
The skills. What are the skills people need to learn? What are the skills that are being automated away? And as you
Yeah.
point, as work eliminates some skill, as technology eliminates the need for some skills, it creates the need for new ones, and
Hmm.
it's happening faster and faster and
Yeah.
faster. And then you throw in on top of it, the changing labor market, which is by the two big tectonic forces in the book
Hmm.
Talent Tectonics. It's an analogy to plate tectonics, the things that are changing the landscape of work.
Hmm.
One is digitalization, obviously, but the
Yeah.
other big one is demographics. There's
Hmm.
more people aging out of a lot of labor markets and entering into them.
Yeah.
And this is creating shortages of skilled labor.
Hmm.
But I want to emphasize one thing. I get I get angry, part of
Hmm.
me, when people say declining birth rates are bad for economies.
Hmm.
That's not true. They're bad for economies that historically relied on exploiting large numbers of underemployed people.
Hmm.
We have enough people on the planet to do the work that needs to be
Correct.
done. We just need to get far better at realizing the potential of all individuals on this planet. Something like
That's
60% of the people in the world are
reallocation of
engaged.
work rather than centralization of work, right? In
Yeah,
organization.
absolutely.
Correct.
Something like 60% of people on the work are engaged in work that's not even
Right.
counted as work.
Correct.
You know, it's sustenance farming, it's things
Correct.
like that.
Correct.
And there's a really great line, I don't know who said it, that said potential is equally distributed across society, opportunity is not. Technology will enable us to identify the skills that we need,
Hmm.
but it also enables us to find people that have the potential to learn those skills based on what they already know.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it allows you to think much more broadly than we did in the past. So like
Right.
an example that I'll use, which actually was done using human intelligence, but it illustrates this
Hmm.
idea, is I used to work for a big retail company and I was helping them with staffing technology, and this was 20
Hmm.
years ago.
Hmm.
And to fill store managers is a critical role in
Yep.
retail. And there's always a shortage of store
Correct.
managers. And a recruiter realized that historically they'd look for people that had been store managers before. And I don't know how a recruiter had this realization, but they said, well, if you look at the basic things we're asking store managers to do, which is keep track of schedules,
Hmm.
manage multiple
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
deal with interpersonal
Hmm.
relationships, da 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 da, da,
Hmm.
teach new employees things. They said it's a lot like a high school teacher.
Hmm.
You know, there's a lot of similarities between a high school
Well,
teacher and what they do, you
yeah.
know, get people to get
That's
along.
that's an epiphany, right?
Yeah, it's an epiphany because they said the surface skills qualifications look very different, but if
Right.
you get to the below skills of organization, people interaction, there's a lot of
And you
similarities.
never think of hiring a high school teacher for a store
A
manager
store
role.
manager. So they started doing this, and then this is really important, and not because they hired them, but they were very successful.
Hmm.
And so suddenly that changed the whole recruiting. And suddenly, like
Correct.
everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, this whole new source of talent."
Correct.
Well, that's what this skills management technology is automating. It's
Hmm.
that sort of
Yeah.
insight,
Yeah.
which we would associate with a human insight, but it's actually a
Correct.
pattern recognition thing.
Right.
That is one of the big things. But if you look at that, that allows us to find people with potential. But then
True.
the next thing is if you're hiring a school teacher versus a store manager, a
Hmm.
person needs to be a school teacher as well as a store manager, you're going to have to train them differently.
That's true.
And you're going to have to like rethink the job. And
Right.
so the other place where where AI is having a big impact on learning, there's multiple. The next one is it's helping people identify training resources really
Hmm.
quickly
Hmm.
and increasingly moving away from big classes to micro learning,
Right.
like and finding ways to embed it in the flow of work. So like, okay, here's the issue right now. I've got a customer in this situation, or I've got this problem with this machine, or sometimes you can scan it with your phone and it kind of like looks at the machine and
Hmm.
it then it delivers it in your phone like a very specific micro learning.
Hmm.
That stuff is being driven by AI,
Yeah.
you
In
know,
real
and
time, in the flow of work. I think
in
more
real
importantly.
time. It's like, well, how are you able to do it? It's because you've got like a lot of very sophisticated pattern recognition
Correct.
technology. So I think people sometimes don't think about AI, but it's being driven by AI.
Yep. Yep.
Um, the other, I have a list. So
Hmm.
tell me if you want
No, no,
to get
please.
started. Okay. So I said skills identification, skills matching, finding potential.
Right.
Basically, is that skills
Right.
matching,
Right.
micro learning.
Yeah.
The coaching, which we talked about earlier,
Hmm.
it democratizes coaching. I think on that one, you know, try to find some way to keep the human in the loop, but there
Hmm.
you can, there's like, I actually was really fascinating. I was listening to a podcast with somebody who was looking for a job and he
Hmm.
trained like a chat GPT
Hmm.
to be his career guidance coach. He loaded
Yep.
all of his like Vita and resume into
Hmm.
it. And then he would feed it in job descriptions and say, should I apply for this job? How should I apply for this
Hmm.
job?
Hmm.
And he said, so and I think that's a really good point too. If you look at some of the most powerful uses of especially generative AI and micro learning,
Yeah.
we tend to think of ChatGPT, which is this massive large language model.
Right.
It's
Right.
actually narrow applications.
Hmm.
It's solving very specific things like coaching somebody on how to take a job interview.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so these narrow applications of it, I think, are proving to be more
Yeah.
powerful,
Yeah.
where you're putting in very specific information. But it's like coaching with the next one. So I said skills
Yeah.
identification, matching, micro learning, coaching.
Right.
The another one that I think is really interesting, and it's kind of related to this first, is social learning.
Hmm.
That companies are finding the people that know the most about what people need to learn in the organization are probably
Yeah.
people that are already working for your company.
Correct.
I mean, there are exceptions, but you've got subject matter experts in your company that know a
Right.
lot of stuff.
Right.
companies are starting to use AI technology to capture information from really knowledgeable subject matter experts,
And
feed
replicate
it
them.
into their learning programs, and in an ideal world, also using it to keep some level of mentoring or conversation so
Hmm.
that person's kind of like the way a professor teaches,
Yeah.
not in
Yeah.
terms of big classes, but they assemble information students need, but then they also are there to like talk about it and have a dialogue.
Correct.
Um, that's another social learning. I think is having an impact on that.
Hmm.
A other one is virtual metaverse stuff,
Okay.
where it's really interesting. There's a lot of virtual reality technology,
Hmm.
and people kind of came in as this big thing, and then no one talks about it. It hasn't gone away. I
Yeah.
think you can see it coming back. That
Hmm.
virtual learning and immersive experiential learning, if you think about that, that's really powerful. Simulations, things like
Correct.
that. Particularly for certain kinds of jobs, like when you have to read human emotions. Like I've
Hmm.
seen a really cool virtual reality. And this isn't again what we think of as generative AI, but generative AI underlies these things
Correct.
working.
Correct.
Um,
Absolutely.
where it would go in and you'd be asked to interact with a virtual customer, and maybe they're upset. And so there's
Hmm.
an element of emotional control. And it actually can do things like scan your face, and it can
Yeah.
say, you know, hey, you need to learn to hold this expression, or can
Yeah.
listen to what you say. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Assess your body language, give you feedback around it.
Yeah, and that's really cool for a couple reasons.
Hmm.
When you look at this immersive technology, it's obviously really valuable if this part of what you're trying to teach people is spatial awareness.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
um, like loading trucks and stuff like that.
Right. Right.
But there's also a big part of it where there is emotional control. Like one
Hmm.
application was people inspecting like basements or flooded basements. You had to go into
Hmm.
a very claustrophobic space, and part of
Yeah.
it was learning to control your emotions. Or another one, and this is kind of scary to think about, was armed robbery in a retail
Right.
store. They're like, it's one thing to know, literally the experience of a person putting a gun in your face and learning what
Correct.
am I supposed to
Right.
do. Um, to the point where they almost had to do like psychological safety counseling because they're like,
Right.
"Well,
Right.
we're
Right.
preparing you for what could actually happen."
Hmm.
The third is emotional intelligence, where you have to pick up human cues and
Hmm.
react to it. So
Hmm.
it's like this really cool there.
Hmm.
But the fourth thing that's cool about the virtual reality stuff is it's entertaining. I mean, I remember talking to a guy who had implemented, he goes, they'd implemented it for safety. He goes, it's the first time in my career I've ever had employees come up to us and say, can I bring my kids in to do safety training?
Yeah,
I
for
mean,
sure. It is
so
a video game, no?
yeah. And I think when you get and so I think so I've kind of hit on a bunch of these, but all
Yeah.
of these things, what's happening is we're getting this more natural language. It's accelerating the ability to do all of this
True.
stuff.
True. True.
Um, And I think what I really say when I talk to HR, I think one thing as we look at this is if you're a learning professional or an HR professional, you have to
Hmm.
remember your job is not to implement technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your job is to solve business problems.
Yeah.
But your understanding of technology enables and constrains
True.
your imagination of what problems we can solve and how
Hmm.
we can solve them. So if you
Hmm.
look at that, if you're not aware of some of the things that I just talked about, you're never going to think about using them.
That's true.
So I think there's a big component of being a learning professional, which is
Hmm.
finding some way to constantly stay aware of what the new applications. So it suddenly
Yeah.
makes you realize, oh my gosh, we could do this entirely differently.
I think being more open to experimentation also, no, Steve. I think,
You,
yeah, I think that traditional curve that we talk about, early adopters versus late bloomers. I think more and more companies need to become early adopters now because I don't think you can wait for technology to ripen, and technology is ripening at a very, very fast pace, right? You'll be left far behind if you keep waiting for it to ripen even further and even more, right?
yeah, I think that's a good. It's almost instead of early adopter, I'd say like early dabbler. Is that phrase
Yeah.
dabbling?
And not only that, I would say become part of the designing process with young startups and organizations. Be part of their product
Absolutely.
journey so that you can actually influence. the use cases and a lot of applications that you would, envision for your organization specifically,
A-
right?
And this is a great comment you just made, because I think the issue we have with so many applications of AI to work is eliminate jobs so we can eliminate headcount
Yeah,
costs.
yeah,
And a
yeah,
matter of fact, a lot of companies eliminate the headcount costs and just use
yeah,
AI as an excuse for doing
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Um, I would say what we should be doing is using the repetitive part of the works, but then repositioning people and freeing up people's time to
Correct,
play around.
correct, correct.
Going back to what we want humans to do is not repetitive
Absolutely.
stuff. We want them to
Think.
either
You
be
want them to
really good
think.
at caring for people or
Correct,
really good at being creative
correct,
and visionary and imaginative.
correct.
AI has no imagination.
Not at all.
It
It
doesn't
is
have a
actually
concept of the
feeding on
future.
our imagination, right? It's basically as good as how imaginative are we to be able to use it, right? Like you said, LLM is basically the core technology, but how do you build applications, the micro applications to be able to use for what use cases? It's basically going to make all the difference.
Where do you apply? Yeah, and it's funny as it's kind of getting philosophical, but I never really thought about it for it. I was earlier talking about the one thing AI can never do is it can never care for another person, because
Yeah,
that's fundamentally an organic process
right,
tied to giving a gift of your
right.
life to another living thing. I would say it can never also imagine too, because imagination is driven by the fact that we're mortal and
Correct,
we're thinking all the time about where am I going to be tomorrow, because we
correct,
only have a limited number of tomorrows.
correct.
So it's something that's wired into our
That's true.
brain to imagine how the world might be different.
And become
AI
excited
does
about it.
that. You know, AI will take whatever you'll do, and it may just keep
Correct,
iterating on the same thing over and over again to the point that it
correct,
eliminates
correct,
humanity. That would
correct.
be bad.
Yeah, yeah.
But but it will never be, it's never aspiring to
Hmm.
anything. I think that's an important thing. We need to use AI. I'm like having an epiphany here, aren't
Yeah.
they? So this is great. These are the best interviews where you're like, wait, I never thought of it. That as especially as learning, because that's one of the key themes in talent tectonics that I talk about when
Hmm.
I look at the
Hmm.
future of work and
Hmm.
technology is, as we are really employing people to do uniquely human things, the
Hmm.
two things is caring and imagining. That's
Hmm.
uniquely human.
Correct.
And we really need to realize that historically we manage people based on productive, not based on learning, which is
Yeah.
what we really need them to do. Always thinking about how can I do this better.
Right.
Humans are one of the biggest myths about humans is we fear change.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's not true. We are skeptical of change and we're anxious about it because we
Hmm.
tend to think about it in terms of we fear punishment.
Hmm.
What are you going to make me do that I don't want to do? How are you going to make my life worse? We're kind
Yeah.
of wired that way,
Right.
but we're actually wired for change.
Hmm.
The competitive niche of humans as a species is our ability to adapt to changing environments. It's called learning.
Steve, this is a very again. I think this discussion is moving to very philosophical discussion.
Okay, I
But
will come back.
I
Sorry.
no no I have to bring this philosophical point here, right? As humans, you rightly said that we are wired to change, right? I think we have
Mm-hmm.
gone through that evolution process. But if you look at organizations, right, as organizations grow, they become resistant to change.
Mm-hmm.
And
That
these
is
organizations are being run by humans, which is basically the big clash, isn't it? Right? You want it to
it.
change, but the organizational DNA is not to change, right? Because they're
It
happy in the way they are working typically.
Well, yeah, that is gets into a whole economic thing. Actually, it's funny. I keep plugging my book, but when I talked about technology, when I kind of give an overview of technology in my book, the real said, well, why do we need HR technology?
Hmm.
And part of it is to enable large organizations to act like small ones.
Yeah.
There are things psychologically that happen as workforces get bigger that create inertia. So
Hmm.
like we can't know each other, so we tend
Hmm.
to manage people based off job titles instead of
Yeah.
based off of what they actually know,
Yeah.
which is going back to like AI and skills-based management is
Hmm.
really kind of
Hmm.
enabling you to manage people based on not what your title is, but hey, I know you know how to
What
do
can you
this.
do? What's your
Yeah.
capability? What can you do? Right?
Yeah, the example I use when I work, I've worked for startups at different times in my career, and I've worked for very, very large
Hmm.
companies. And like in a startup, remember we had a customer coming in who was from Japan, and we know they didn't speak Japanese. I mean, they didn't
Hmm.
speak English very well.
Hmm.
And then somebody remembered, oh, that so and so from marketing used to live in Japan, and we
Hmm.
brought him into the
Hmm.
meeting, and it was
Hmm.
nothing to do with their job, but it was
Hmm.
like we just knew them at that level.
Yeah.
You can use technology to mimic those sorts of things in big
Right.
companies. You can never, I mean, a big company can never act like a small company where everyone knows everyone else, but it can create a much more intimate feeling about a big company.
Correct.
And there's a lot of examples that I provide when I talk
Mhm.
about that. But I think the other thing is big companies are so much focused on productivity and efficiency
Hmm.
for understandable reasons that I think, though, what they lose is they lose that freeing people up with time to
Hmm.
learn and play. When you're a small startup company,
Hmm.
that's really all you're doing largely.
Correct. Correct.
You're just, wow, figuring stuff out. Let's try this. But I think part of it too, though, is you're driven by a really shared sense of purpose too. And I think when you get to be really big companies, you get siloed, you have
Correct.
different goals.
Correct.
Um, you also have people in a small startup company. It's like, look, if I don't hit your number like in 3 quarters, your company will cease to exist. And these big companies, they can set back. And I talk a lot about the psychology. The
Yeah.
psychology changes. In small companies, the way people get credibility and influence and power is they have an impact on the growth and profitability of that
Yeah.
company
Yeah.
because it's aware. In big companies, they appear relevant. A lot of the job is,
True.
and it's
True.
not, I'm not faulting the people. They're just surviving in the environment that they're in, where
Correct.
the job is not about getting stuff done. The job is about
Correct.
appearing critical,
Correct.
which I actually go tying this back to something pragmatic, again, the
Mm-hmm.
philosophical. A big part of using this technology for learning is creating a psychologically safe work environment
Hmm.
that encourages and rewards people
Yeah.
for taking risks,
Yeah.
for trying things differently. And so if you want a learning culture, you better get serious about changing your performance management and compensation
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, they're,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Awesome. So I think just taking the discussion forward, right? So we talked about what are the applications, but what are the gray areas for AI, Steve? Right? What should we be wary about as an AI practitioner, as a technology practitioner? Right? What do you think? You know, organizations, application designers, and developers like ourselves. What should we be keeping in mind primarily?
Well, we have to remember that AI just takes data and it blindly applies it.
Hmm.
So if you feed biased data, and this is talked about a lot, if you feed biased data into AI, it's going to be biased. Now it can hide that bias,
Right.
but I think that's one thing. I think that probably at a broader level with AI, one of the I like to try to think of historical
Hmm.
analogies where what we're doing is we're developing highly complicated technology that the end user cannot possibly understand.
Yeah.
And yet they're supposed to evaluate whether or not it's effective, but they can't because they can't understand it. What is very reminiscent of is the rise of the pharmaceutical industry in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where suddenly you had this whole thing of snake oil and quack science, but you also had really good, hey, we discovered penicillin, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But your average person can't tell the difference between what is a valid pharmaceutical and what is total bogus stuff. So we created the FDA,
Yeah.
the food, and we have this whole sophisticated process. And why, yes, there's certainly issues with it.
Hmm.
The alternative, in an unregulated medical thing is not good. People
Yeah.
selling based on their charisma as opposed to their actual, validated proof that it works. We're kind of the same phase with AI technology.
Yeah. That's a nice analogy,
That
Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the broad applications, I mean, look at like social technology, which again,
Right.
AI, why these social feeds that they are not designed to trigger your knowledge. They're
Hmm.
designed to trigger your emotion because they know that that's what makes people pay attention is
Yeah.
emotion more than knowledge. And so they just manipulate the heck out of people's
Hmm.
emotions. It's
Hmm.
unhealthy. It's creating really bad damage,
Well,
but we don't have any regulation over it.
correct. And similar arguments were given for social as well, right? That hey, we
Yeah.
need regulation, and then self-regulation came in, and okay, we can all argue whether it's working or not. But I think AI is heading in the same direction.
AI is, and those social things are the first applications of AI. I think people don't realize that the machine learning algorithms and the
Correct.
social
They're
they've
feeding off the
they've been
social.
doing it for a long
Correct.
time.
Correct.
I think one of the things that Chat GPT did for us that was healthy and I actually said this is why they did it. I think they
Hmm.
also did it because it was one of the best marketing in the
Yeah.
history of marketing.
Hmm.
But but the person said is you had this generative AI capability. It had advanced, and nobody realized how much it advanced till somebody just loaded the whole internet in it and made it
Correct.
free.
Correct.
It's a little bit like remote work capabilities. We had the ability to work remotely, but nobody realized until COVID forced us to
That we
rethink
could. Yeah.
technology. We
Yeah.
just weren't
Correct.
using it.
Correct.
So I think that, yeah, when I look at that now, we have this technology and it can be very harmful, and the challenge is we need some form of regulation. And I'm not necessarily a big fan of regulation, but there's certain times where it's just too easy, just like with medical technology. It's
Yeah.
too easy to get people to use stuff that's not good for them or
Hmm.
society.
Hmm.
So I don't know how in the world that regulation that may help, but
Yeah.
that's the analogy I use to it. Um, the other thing that isn't a gray area, is but is really a challenge. I think we have to do is we have to, going back to rethinking work, we have to rethink how we value people's capabilities and expertise.
Hmm.
Um, that, like, I'll give you an example. My wife is a family medicine doctor, and she has to take board exams every whatever
Yep.
few years, and it is good. That's good. Going back to regulating, you
Mhm.
want doctors that know what they're doing.
Correct.
But they've changed the process that now they can use generative AI. Because that makes sense. Would you want to go to a
Wow.
doctor that didn't use generative AI to keep up with the latest medical things? No, you definitely want to go to a doctor. Now, that doesn't mean that you'd only want them to use generative AI and all they do is read the internet. But on the other hand, so there's a lot more that goes into it, right? And
Correct.
what makes them a doctor is not their ability to Google things.
Hmm.
What makes them a doctor is their ability to interpret it. Going back to AI is dumb. It
Yeah.
just sends you this information. But they're also saying that, yeah, we'd expect you to do it. So, like, when you evaluate somebody's knowledge to say, are you capable of solving these problems? We'd expect them to use the tools that are available to them. Matter of fact, that's like the best definition of intelligence that I've
Yeah.
heard, that actually came from my own father, which was intelligence is your ability to solve the problems confronting you with the resources available.
Correct.
And that's when an intelligent person would not ignore the use
That's
of
true.
AI. So
Absolutely.
when you're looking at like learning or training certifications, does it make sense to ask people to like do rote memorization? That's
Mm.
stupid.
Yep.
But then we have to think about it. Well, but then what is it? What are we evaluating? And it
Mm.
gets much more sophisticated. So, and actually coming back to cool uses of AI, there's another company, and I'm intentionally not mentioning company names either way, but if you want to know, reach out to me personally. There's
Mhm.
all kinds of cool names
Mhm.
that is using AI to develop reasoning interviews similar to how like an expert would evaluate you. So, like, going back
Yeah.
to my example of professors teaching,
Yep. Yep.
a really good professor, like in
Mm.
grad school, when you have
Mm.
this ability, they don't do standardized tests. You go
Correct.
in and they challenge you in a
Correct.
conversation about,
Right.
do you know what you're talking
Right.
about?
Right.
This AI simulates that
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
And it doesn't do it in an evaluative way. It actually gives suggestions. Well, you didn't think about one more thing that I'm looking for. It tries to help you be successful. But what's good is, even if you're on generative AI, it's going along,
Correct.
you still have to figure out what it's looking for.
Correct. Correct.
And it's and so, but I think this is going to be one of the really significant challenges, is we have to rethink how we evaluate what it means to be an expert in
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And also, and this is also even more challenging, is we have to reevaluate our economic models for how we pay people. Because
Mm.
increasingly the jobs that are being left, or where we're wanting people to be really good caring humans, our society historically, for actually very sexist and racist reasons,
Mm.
devalues service work.
That's true. Yep.
And so, we say, why is the person that installs or builds the hospital bed paid way more than the person that sits next to your grandmother and makes sure she's okay?
Yeah.
The home healthcare aide.
Correct.
We need to, and I don't know how to do this, but I really think as a society, we need to
I
seriously
know.
look at um, how we financially value people. Because now I'd say it doesn't look good if we stick to
Correct.
if our comp plans stay in 20th century comp plans in a 21st century world. I
It is
fear
bound to break. It is bound to break.
it is bound to break. Yeah, we don't need another workers' revolution.
For sure. All right. So, Steve, parting comments, parting wisdom for L&D leaders. Why and how should they start looking at AI if they're not already? And more importantly, how can they convince their CXOs to actually give them dollars to experiment? Start experimenting at least,
Start,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, we'll definitely start messing around with it. You find a way to mess around with it, jump in. It's accessible. I think there's an explosion of interest in the technology out there. I think your point about go out and find those startup companies, smaller
Mm,
companies that are dying to find people to work with,
mm,
as well as the really big companies too. But to
mm,
be honest, the really cool innovation tends to come from smaller companies anyhow.
mm,
But have somebody get what I call a true HRIT professional. Make
mm.
sure you have that in your organization because a true HRIT professional is not an IT person who reluctantly supports HR or an HR person who reluctantly uses technology. It's a person who's excited about how technology is enabling us to change
Right.
HR. I
Right.
think that's a function to
Mm,
trying to find people in your company and you have them and
mm,
really make that a formal part of their role. Their idea is just to like check out cool stuff and say, wow,
mm.
how could we use this?
Yeah.
And then explore it. As far as how to justify this internally, I think you just go and you provide examples and you challenge the things of the leaders, and it is. And I'll close with this: remind your leaders, and I think a lot of leaders do not understand this. That what really drives our use of technology is it familiar? Is it easy? Is
Mm,
it effective?
mm.
Most of our use of technology, and the older you get, we tend to prefer the technology that's familiar because we know how to do it. Even if it's not even that easy to do, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's the most effective. And when you
Correct.
look at, like, they talk about generational differences in adoption of
Yeah.
technology, and it's one of the few places where there actually is a difference based on
Mm.
age. Younger people have no familiarity with anything. So
At
whatever their
all.
familiar is the technology. And people tend to have a preference for the technology they were using when they were like 16 years old, right? Because
Kind of.
that's kind of how when I came into the technology world. And so we're seeing this with like hybrid remote work, it's like, well, that's not how we worked. And it's
Yeah.
like
The
really
first love.
challenge
The first
your
love is always
business
special.
leaders to say, we need to find the technologies that are more effective and not lull ourselves into complacency because it's familiar and comfortable for us.
Right.
And you can put out a bunch of examples on that
Mm,
in learning, a bunch of examples. And sometimes you can tie to their actual own frustrations, right?
mm, mm.
So I would say it's really about finding concrete examples to get the business leaders saying, if we're not imagining the future, somebody else is, and either we're
Absolutely.
going to be, and it's moving so fast that you'll find yourself on your back foot when it comes to AI
Correct.
very, very quickly if
Correct.
you don't stay ahead of it.
Awesome. Very, very wise words to come to the end of the conversation. I really had a lot of fun. I think this was one of the most philosophical discussions, and I love philosophical discussions. So thank you for that, Steve. I think it really made me enjoy the discussion, and I'm sure our audience is going to love it as well.
Thank you.
So
I hope so. And I hope it didn't get too philosophical. I always try to balance the
no,
philosophical with the
no,
practical.
oh,
But when it
absolutely.
comes to something as
Yeah.
transformational as AI, you really can't separate the
Nope.
two.
Nope.
So,
You have to look at philosophical questions.
yeah. All right. Well,
Absolutely.
Ashish, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you for joining in, Steve. Well, there you go, folks. So this was it for today's episode. Do tell us how you found it and reach out to Steve for any questions on technology or AI. And if you have questions about Risely and AI in leadership development, reach out to me. Happy to answer them. Until next time, you folks take care and be safe. Bye bye.